Lana always had an uncanny intuition for culinary delights, so when she mentioned that the KFC near our vacation spot had received stellar reviews, I felt a shiver of unease. Why this particular place, in a city we barely knew? Now, Lana's voice was urgent when I questioned the timing. Even though we'd only touched down in this foreign city for a few hours, I had a growing sense of foreboding, as I did not feel obliged to move through such a new place without some proper assessment of the locals. Lana handled the map, and I drove through rough and narrow streets until we found it. She squealed and jumped out of the car when we arrived. She rushed through the streets before I could even put my things together in the car. She was at the door to the KFC when my eyes trailed her, and she pointed up at the sign. The windshield in the distance between us made her inaudible, but her lips moved, and then she opened the door to the KFC. I snatched my wallet from the car and moved quickly to meet up with her. I was more careful with the streets, looking this way and that before I crossed straight up into the KFC, and I held the door open to let myself in. "Hey!" I saluted the man behind the counter. He was a dark-skinned man, but I could tell it was more from an active life in the sun than from melanin. He had thick hair and thick eyebrows. His jaws were neatly shaved, but his mustache was pretty decent. He had a curious assessment of me when I walked towards him. It was only when I was done with the fascination of his being that I discovered something amiss. "Hey, a woman just walked in here." "Don't play games, Lana. We don't have all day." I trailed off my question when I suspected a prank. The man behind the counter looked at me as though he suspected I was inebriated. I found no amusement in such a condescending gaze. I did not feel too good with Lana out of my sight so suddenly in the new city. "No woman," the man said decisively, looking away from me. What did he mean? No woman? He'd spoken 2 words in the vernacular, and I felt my muscles tighten and dread. He did not seem to be a man that joked or a man that played such games with strangers. There was no jest in his eyes, and instead, it was a dismissiveness of my presence that he wore. "Woman walked in here minutes ago with blonde hair." Here I tried my best broken English to describe Lana's features, but the man's pale glance was unaltered. If he was acting, I reasoned, he was a damn good actor. "No woman," he stated again, irritated by my persistence. "You buy some food? No?" For a moment I doubted that I had come with Lana at all. It was where my horror began. My mind began to conjure scenarios, and it threw them at me violently. I looked outside the KFC and saw that my car was still parked where it was. I leaned on the counter with my sweat-stained hands. "Please tell me the truth, I beg." The man did not budge. His frown was as stiff as rock. There was no truth. There was nothing to tell, nothing but a big sharp cleaver, which he produced from under the counter. "Stupid Yankee. Do you want KFC?" he asked, and swung his clever thrice in a direction which I suspected he wanted me to go. "TOS Yankee and one day good business." The light bulb went off in my head. The KFC was bait. There was no intention to sell anything to us. Horror dawned on me, and I whimpered to expel air from my lungs. I thought about Lana, and the utter horror of her life at that moment made my heart sink. I wanted to be by her side quickly, so I complied with this man. "Where are you, Adam?" The man spoke into a phone before I realized he had begun to make a phone call. "Be here in an hour." He pushed behind me with his knife, and I walked gently as we made our way from the general KFC hall into an unlit passageway that was reeking of antiseptic and harsh detergent. The deeper we traveled, the more distinct I could hear sobbing. I pushed towards it instinctively. He was right behind me to remind me of pace. "Not so quick, Yankee," he cussed at me, slapping the flat of the cleaver on my neck. I whelped. The torture had begun, and I knew it would go on for a while. My heartbeat spiked as we moved closer to the door. I pushed it open gingerly and surely. There was Lana, more humble than I had ever seen her at any time. She did not lift her head to see it was me who entered. The door was wide enough to accommodate one person, and I knew if I could pull off one maneuver, we would escape the horrors of being kidnapped and possibly killed. I placed my faith in my instinct when I was fully in the room. Just as I anticipated, the man overstepped. He whimpered in surprise as I backed into his abdomen with my lower body. His upper body pushed forward, and he gave up his arm for me to grip onto. Lana stirred in the chaos, and her crying became loud wails of fear and panic. I threw the man overhead, and he landed on his back, and his head knocked against the corner floor of the wall. The knife slipped from his hand, and he blacked out with his neck at an angle. I marched over to him and stomped down on his neck, effectively ending what would be of his wretched life. He gulped once, and that was it. I hurried over to Lana's side and I picked her up from the floor. She recoiled at first, and when she saw it was me, she fell into my hands in relief. "Let's get out of here," I said to her. "He said he would kill me," Lana cried, eyes glistening with raw fear. "He won't be doing that. Is dead," I said as we began to make our way back. I was driving home after doing some shopping, and I don't remember the exact time, but it was maybe like 9 p.m. or so. I was craving a chicken sandwich from KFC, so when I saw one close to the stores I have been in, I stopped at it. I went into the drive-thru to order faster, but when I arrived at the menu and rolled my window down, I didn't hear anything at the other end. I waited for about a minute and looked around. The lights were still on, so it looked like they might still be open. However, nobody was saying anything. I asked if anybody was there, but still didn't get a response. I noticed headlights approaching behind me and saw a larger-looking truck pulling into the drive-thru behind me. I decided to look online to see if they were actually open or not. I took out my phone, and for a minute I was looking to find the KFC when I heard the truck behind me honk. I looked and couldn't see who was in the truck due to the bright headlights, but I figured the guy wanted me to hurry up. As I was on my phone, I heard a door open and shut behind me. The next thing I knew, I saw a man approaching my driver's window. I rolled it down, and the guy was angry right away. He had longer hair and a beard and was yelling at me to hurry up and said I was wasting his time. I told the man that they were closed, and nobody had answered the intercom. The man didn't seem to understand me, though, and kept going on about how I was wasting everybody's time and how mad he was. He began yelling at me in a threatening way, and it seemed as though he was likely drunk or high or on some sort of drugs. He really wasn't making a whole lot of sense, and I decided to just tell the man that I was sorry and that I was going to leave. I didn't know what he was capable of, and the man then cursed at me and started returning to his truck. I was happy he was gone. I began to drive away. I figured he could find out for himself that the place was closed and nobody would answer. But when I drove off, he began following me. He was honking and revving his engine as he drove extremely close to my car. I was concerned because if the man was on drugs, he certainly shouldn't be operating a vehicle. He also was driving a big truck. It was much larger than my little car. I drove out onto the road and he followed. I was hoping he would pass me in a short time. After we got past the businesses to a more rural area, he did begin to pass me. But when the man's truck got about even with my car, I saw him roll down his window and start yelling at me again. He then veered his truck towards my car and was starting to run me off the road. I slammed on my brakes and stopped, and the truck kept going and ended up crashing into the ditch. I stopped there, on the side of the road, and saw the man exit the vehicle and began running towards mine. I sped away after that, and I called the police and reported the whole incident. Looking back, I'm glad the man went into the ditch because he could have caused a serious accident or got somebody hurt. I'm not sure what his problem was or why he was acting that way. This is a scary story that happened to me. I was hungry and craving a burger, so I decided to go to a KFC. I just got home from a night out and it was past midnight, so I knew the restaurant would be nearly empty. Little did I know that it turned out to be one of the scariest nights of my life. When I walked through the parking lot, there were only 2 cars there. I walked into the restaurant, and when I pushed the doors open, I was hit with a wave of cold air. The air conditioning was on full blast, and I immediately regretted not bringing a jacket. The place was almost completely empty, except for a few people scattered around. I could see a man in a hoodie sitting in a booth, a couple of teenagers at a table, and a lone worker behind the counter. As I walked up to the counter, I noticed that the worker looked tense. She was young, with blonde hair tied up in a messy bun. She had a name tag and it read, Emily. I could see the sweat beading on her forehead. She kept glancing around at the entrance. I could feel that something was off and my gut told me to leave, but my hunger got the better of me. I ordered a burger and fries and waited for my food. While I was waiting, I noticed that Emily kept checking her phone and looked more and more nervous with every passing second. Suddenly, one of the customers, the guy in a hoodie, walked up to the counter. By then, there was another worker there, a man who seemed to be the manager. He was around 5'5" and overweight. The man in the hoodie started arguing with him. I was still standing there waiting for my order. I tried not to pay attention to them, but it was impossible to ignore. The man in the hoodie was screaming nonsense at the manager, and the manager tried to calm him down. There was no use. Emily stood behind her coworker looking scared. None of us knew what to do. Suddenly, the man in the hoodie grabbed the manager by the shirt and jumped over the counter. When he did that, I noticed a knife in one of his hands. I stumbled back, not knowing what to do. When I finally got my bearings, I saw that Emily was already on the phone with the police. Luckily, there were 2 officers already in the area, and they must have arrived in less than 2 minutes. They were able to subdue the man, and when they pulled him off, I noticed the pool of blood on the ground, and it was growing. It was coming from the manager, who was still on the ground. An ambulance arrived in another minute, and the manager was taken away. I went home that night, but I was hardly able to sleep. I couldn't believe what happened. It all happened so fast. One minute I was standing there waiting for my food, and in the next I witnessed an attempted murder. I didn't find out exactly what happened to the man in the hoodie, but I imagine he was in big trouble. I returned to that KFC several months later, and I was relieved to see that manager was still at work. Much respect to that guy for being able to recover both physically and mentally from what happened to him. When I saw him, I wanted to ask him how he was doing, but I thought it might not be a good idea to bring up the incident. I gave him a subtle nod, and he nodded back.